Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're jumping into a really fascinating paradox from the Hebrew Bible. It's a moment where the people of Israel ask for something that seems totally allowed, but God takes it as a huge rejection. It's this wild story about how getting exactly what you ask for can sometimes be the worst possible thing.
So here's the question that'll make you scratch your head. On the one hand, God's own law seems to give a green light for having a king. But when the people finally ask for one, God's reaction is basically, "You've just rejected me." How does that work? It sounds like a total contradiction, so let's dig in and figure out what's really going on.
And this slide just lays the whole puzzle out right in front of us. In 1 Samuel, God's verdict is crystal clear. They have rejected me. But then you look back at the law in Deuteronomy, and it says, you may indeed set a king over you. So, which one is it? How can both of these things be true?
Okay, to solve this, we have to rewind. We've got to go back to the original blueprint in the Torah to see what kind of king the law was even talking about in the first place.
So you got to understand, this permission for a king, it wasn't a command. It wasn't an enthusiastic, yes, you should definitely get a king. It was more like a reluctant concession. The law basically anticipated that sooner or later, the Israelites would look around at their neighbors, see all their powerful kings, and say, hey, we want one of those too. So it made an allowance for it, but, and this is the key, it came with some very strict conditions.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. These rules are pretty much the opposite of what any king in the ancient world would do. No multiplying horses, that means no building up a massive army. No multiplying wives, that cuts off the main way kings made political alliances. And no hoarding tons of gold and silver, that's a direct shot at personal greed and empire building. All of these rules were designed to do one thing: keep the king from trusting in his own power and force him to stay dependent on God.
So if he wasn't supposed to be a warlord, what was his job? Well, his primary role was to be a scholar. Seriously, he had to personally write out a copy of the Torah and then read it every single day. His entire job was to be the nation's leading expert on God's law, making sure his rule was based on justice and wisdom, not on the point of a sword.
All right, so keeping that picture of a humble scholar king in mind, let's jump back to that moment in history when the people actually made their request. What were they really asking for? And more importantly, why?
You know, context is everything here. They were coming out of this really chaotic period called the time of the judges. It was just this messy, violent cycle. They'd sin, get invaded, cry out to God for help, and then God would send a temporary hero, a judge, to rescue them. Frankly, they were sick of it. They were tired of feeling so vulnerable and having to wait for God to show up.
And here it is. The smoking gun is right in their own words. Listen closely to that last part. And go out before us and fight our battles. This was never a request for a righteous scholar to teach them the law. This was a demand for a general, a warlord.
What was driving them? It was fear, not faith. Plain and simple. They were done trusting in an invisible God to be their warrior. They wanted someone they could see, a man on a horse with an army behind him. They were basically trying to hire a human to do a job that they felt God just wasn't doing reliably enough for their taste.
And this demand for a warrior king just completely flew in the face of the entire leadership model God had been trying to build for them all along. The two ideas couldn't be more different.
I mean, just think about the story of Gideon from that same period of the Judges. He gathers this huge army, 32,000 soldiers. And what does God do? He tells Gideon to shrink it, and shrink it again, until he's left with just 300 men. Why? To make it absolutely undeniably clear that victory comes from God, not from the size of your army.
Fast forward a few centuries, and you get this perfect example of the Torah's ideal king in Hezekiah. A gigantic Assyrian army is at the gates of Jerusalem, ready to crush them. And what does Hezekiah do? He prays. He trusts, and God provides a miraculous victory. Hezekiah's title wasn't the Conqueror, it was Prince of Peace, a ruler whose strength was in his righteousness.
So let's just lay it all out. You've got two totally different models of a king. On the left is the Torah's version. Power comes from faith, the job is to be a judge, and you submit to God's law. On the right, you've got the world's version. Power comes from armies, the job is to be a warlord, and you assert your own will. When the Israelites asked for a king, they pointed squarely at the model on the right and said, we want that one.
Okay, so now we have all the pieces. We can finally go back to that original paradox and solve it. Why was a request that was technically legal a profound rejection of God?
And it really all comes down to one thing: motive.
The sin wasn't in what they asked for. The law made a space for a king. The sin was in why they asked for it. Their reasoning, their motivation, it revealed a total breakdown of their trust in God. Let's just walk through it. First, they threw out the Torah's vision of a king who would carry the law. Second, they demanded the world's vision of a king who would carry a sword. And third, by asking for a man to fight their battles, they were firing God from his job as their divine protector. That was the rejection. So in the end, they made a trade. They gave up actual, proven, divine protection for the mere illusion of human control. They rejected this whole system built on the idea that real strength comes from humble trust in a higher purpose, and instead they chose the familiar, visible power of swords and chariots.
And you know, this ancient paradox leaves us with a question that feels like it could have been written this morning. Where does true strength in leadership really come from? Is it found in asserting our own strength and control, or in a devotion to a purpose that's bigger than ourselves? Thanks for joining us for this explainer.